This final module, we're looking at terrorism. So from a criminal justice point of view, you're talking about terrorism. You're talking about a subgroup of crimes. That is, terrorist acts are members of the class of criminal acts, so that every terrorist act, you could argue, is a criminal act, and not all criminal acts are terrorist acts. So there's a pretty straightforward formula just to get a rough thumbnail sketch of what terrorism might look like from a criminal justice point of view is a crime plus something. So we will see what I mean in just a minute. I'll give you some more specific examples. And then also be mindful that a terrorist act can be prosecuted as some specific crime sometimes. So we'll look at both sides of that. Generally, terrorists are criminals who use force, violence, in the pursuit of some sort of an extreme ideology. That's what you need to think about, not just a position, political, religious, but extreme. And they use violence or force to pursue this extreme ideology or goal. And then also, although as you're reading through the chapter, you will see, especially maybe with money laundering, that supporting terrorism can be decidedly sophisticated, hard to prosecute even. Terrorism can also be very cheap and easy. So keep in mind that there's a really big circle that you have to draw to encompass everything that we mean by terrorism or terrorist acts. We're going to look at the penal code in Texas to see what our definition is in this state, but just keep in mind there's a lot at play here as you're reading through your chapter. So here, when you're looking at international law, if you're interested at all, something like a treaty with a foreign nation, it becomes law in America. Some lawyers would argue customary international law. We certainly have something like the Geneva Convention. We have other conventions have to do with something like intellectual property. And then we have laws about pirates, and we have some laws about terrorism. But what's important here is, at least for the United Nations, the UN has never defined international terrorism. It has adopted some international agreements or conventions, though. And they've been adopted to deal with things like nuclear terrorism or financing the terrorist, hostages, and bombings. So just keep that in mind. Definition in the United States: violent acts, that would be crimes, plus. Violent acts that would be crimes, plus. Right? The plus is, and are intended to A, intimidate or coerce a civilian population. Intended to B, influence government by intimidation or coercion. Or to a violent act that would be intended to affect government by mass destruction, affect government by assassination, or by kidnapping. So when you're thinking about terrorism, just rough thumbnail sketch, a criminal act, violence that's intended to do something else. There's something more. So on the other hand, you may have a terroristic act that's criminal. It can be prosecuted sometimes either as treason, sedition, or sabotage. So in addition to crimes of general applicability, such as assault with a deadly weapon or murder, like a bomb, there's some other possible charges, criminal charges against terrorists specifically. So treason is a federal crime defined in the Constitution. It could be used to prosecute U.S. nationals who join terrorist groups such as the Taliban. Sedition, also a federal crime, directed at persons conspiring to overthrow the U.S. government by violence. Sabotage, a federal crime, directed at persons damaging or destroying national defense property or materials. So we have treason here, sedition, and sabotage. These are other criminal charges, potential charges against terrorists. So here's some additional things to think about. Terrorizing It's a crime that means to create a state of extreme fear, dread, or fright. Prosecutions for making terroristic threats under state criminal codes generally require proof that the defendant threatened violence against another with the purpose of terrorizing that person. So we're going to look at Texas right now and see how that penal code with the state criminal code handles it. So this is section 22.07. It's a terroristic threat. A person commits an offense, that is a terroristic threat, if he threatens to commit any offense involving violence to any person or property, here's that plus something, with the intent to. So under scenario 1, cause a reaction of any type to his threat by an official or volunteer agency organized to deal with emergencies. So that's one scenario. Or this, any offense involving violence to any person or property with the intent to place any person in the fear of imminent serious bodily injury. 3, to prevent or interrupt the occupation or use of a building, room, place of assembly, place to which the public has access, place of employment or occupation, aircraft, automobile, other form of conveyance, or other public place. So someone calls in a bomb threat to a high school, university, certainly would register here under number 3. Number 4, with the intent to cause impairment or interruption of public communications, public transportation, public water or gas or a power supply or other public service. Number 4. So you'll notice that, 5 and 2 are similar. The key difference here is the fear of imminent serious bodily injury if it's just a person, and then if it's a substantial group, as place the public or substantial group of the public in fear of serious bodily injury, it loses the word imminent. That's the difference between 2 and 5. And then number 6 is influence the conduct or activities of a branch or agency of the federal government, state, or a political subdivision of the state. So that's terroristic threat in Texas. So that is how Texas handles terroristic threat in its criminal code, the penal code, section 2207. Closing this down, it's not just the terrorists who perform the act of violence, but also those who enable them, who support them. It could be prosecuted. We have federal criminal laws aimed at addressing the financing of terrorism, for instance. And if you're in an industry, luxury goods or something like jewelry, there are all sorts of rules about money laundering and cash transactions beyond the scope of this particular class and chapter. Although there is your text deals a little bit with this, but certain industries have to be careful. For instance, you could purchase in Houston substantial amount of value in a handful of gems. What do I mean by that? You could buy emeralds and diamonds for $100,000 worth, and you could set them and wear them. You just wear them right in the airport, on the airplane. You could touch down in another nation, and then you could take $100,000 worth of jewelry off there, and you would have transferred value of 100,000 US dollars from the United States out of the United States without necessarily declaring anything. Because if you get stopped, well, I'm wearing it. Yes, I'm certainly not trying to hide it. You can see it. So it's very difficult. That's just one example. But that's getting money out of the country. Now, not necessarily for some sort of illicit purpose, but if you're in the jewelry industry, you will necessarily have to take measures to protect yourself and also the United States from money laundering in that way. So moving money into and out of the United States is a big deal. If you have ever heard of the Hawala system, there is a way to use the Hawala system that's acceptable, and then there's also illegal use of the Hawala system. And this is essentially a way to very confidentially move money around based on sort of a trustee situation. But you would have person A, and I'm just going to, this is oversimplification, but I'm going to call it banker A, I'm going to call it banker B, although they're not really bankers, right? So you have person A who goes to banker A and deposits $10,000 cash. There is a code given from banker A to person A. Person A gives this code to person B, let's say in another nation. Person B goes to banker B, gives the code, and gets the money. Later on, banker A and banker B, they settle up a whole bunch of accounts. They move money back and forth. They zero things out. So it's an ancient system. It's still used today. Qaeda uses it. There are other terrorists who use this idea. It's based on trust and sort of a capital T trust, where you entrust someone and their fiduciary with the money, and then someone untethered directly gets the money. So think of a wire transfer without the actual wire transfer. So it's a very interesting system if you're interested. There's all sorts of things you can learn online, but it's just one example of moving money in and out of the United States. You can do it with a human carrier, with cash. You can do it with jewels. You can do it with other luxury items. So that means you could wear a Rolex out. You could have an expensive watch worth $300,000. You just wear it, just on your way out. Hard to detect, but you can transfer this kind of money out of the United States, into the United States, among nations, between nations. Something to be mindful of when you're talking about terrorism. You're not just talking about the violence. You're also talking about the people and the groups of people who are supporting it. So from a criminal justice point of view, we want to be able to capture these bad acts and prosecute them under our criminal laws. And each state typically has a terroristic threat or something similar, and the United States has some definitions. And then there are some additional crimes that typically only go with terrorist kind of activities, something like sabotage, sedition, and treason.